On April 14, 1935, the sky turned black at noon. 2 billion tons of continent, 2 billion tons, lifted off the ground and moved east. It reached Chicago by evening. By the next morning, it was darkening New York City. Ships 300 miles offshore found red dust on their decks. This wasn't a storm. This was the land fighting back. And here's what the history books almost always get wrong about the Dust Bowl. This disaster had a crime scene, it had evidence, and it had suspects. The drought didn't cause it. The wind didn't cause it. Human decisions, made over decades, with the best intentions, engineered every single black blizzard. So who's responsible? And why does it matter right now? There is a photograph, black and white, taken somewhere in the southern plains of the United States sometime in 1936. In the frame, a small farmhouse sits at the center of the image. Around it, the land has been swallowed. Dunes of dark earth press against the walls, rising past the windows, nearly consuming the door. The sky behind it is wrong. It is not a sky at all. It is a wall, a solid, churning wall of darkness, so dense it appears to have weight, moving toward the camera like a living thing. There are no people in the photograph. There are no animals. There is no tree. There is only the house, the sand, and the thing coming to finish what it started. This image does not look like America. It looks like the surface of another planet. But it was taken in Kansas, in the middle of the country that fed the world. What happened to the Great Plains between 1930 and 1940 was not a natural disaster in the traditional sense. It was something more disturbing than that. It was a disaster built by human hands over decades, with the best intentions and the worst outcomes. It was a crime committed in slow motion against one of the most biodiverse and resilient ecosystems the continent had ever produced, and it took nearly 10 years, hundreds of millions of acres, and the forced displacement of perhaps 3.5 million people before the full scale of the destruction could even be measured. The case is open. The evidence is everywhere, and it begins long before the first grain of dust ever rose into the air. To understand what broke, you must first understand what existed before it was broken. The Great Plains of North America stretch across a vast interior corridor of the continent, running roughly from the Canadian border down through Texas, covering portions of 10 states and an area larger than Western Europe. For thousands of years before European settlement, this region was one of the most ecologically stable grassland systems on Earth. The native grasses, blue grama, buffalo grass, switchgrass, side oats grama, had evolved over millions of years to survive precisely the conditions that would later be mistaken for vulnerability. They were drought-resistant. Their roots descended deep into the soil, sometimes 8, 10, 12 feet below the surface, forming a dense, interlocked mat that held the earth in place against wind and erosion. They had survived ice ages, prolonged droughts, periodic fires, and the thundering passage of 60 million bison across their surface without losing coherence. The soil beneath those grasses was extraordinary. Dark, rich, layered topsoil accumulated over millennia of decomposing organic matter, the biological inheritance of an ecosystem in perfect internal balance. Scientists would later call it one of the most fertile land surfaces on the continent. Farmers who arrived in the late 19th century simply called it black gold. And this is where the first layer of evidence appears. The homesteaders who began arriving in the 1880s and 1890s brought with them a set of assumptions forged in the wetter, more forgiving climates of the eastern United States and Europe. They saw the grassland, and they saw waste. They saw deep, dark soil, and they saw potential. They did not see an ecosystem. they saw a surface to be cleared, and so they cleared it. Initially with draft horses and steel plows, then, after 1910, with something far more powerful and far more efficient at destruction. The gasoline-powered tractor had arrived in the plains. Remember that detail. Hold it. Because it matters more than almost anything else in this case. By the 1920s, the industrialization of plains agriculture was proceeding at a pace that would have seemed fantastical to any homesteader of the previous century. A single tractor pulling a gang plow could turn over in one day what had taken a team of horses and a farmer an entire week to accomplish. And the economics were simple, brutally simple. The more land you plowed, the more wheat you planted, and the more money you made. Wheat prices had soared during the First World War, when European fields lay shattered and the Allied nations needed American grain to survive. The plains responded to that demand with missionary zeal. Between 1910 and 1930, approximately 33 million acres of native grassland on the southern plains were stripped and plowed under. 33 million acres. The root mats that had held the continent's topsoil in place for geological time were torn apart, turned upside down, and left exposed to the sky. In their place grew wheat. Wheat as far as the eye could see. Wheat from horizon to horizon. The farmers called this era the Great Plow-Up. The local newspapers called it prosperity. The land had no word for it at all. It simply waited. Here is the second layer of evidence, and it is one that the historical record makes unmistakable. The prosperity of the 1920s on the plains was built on a geological lie. The decade happened to coincide with an unusually wet climatic cycle for the region. Rainfall was above average, crops flourished, prices held, confidence was absolute. Entire towns were built on the assumption that the land would continue to perform, that the rain would continue to fall, that the wheat would continue to grow. Nobody asked the question that the evidence demanded. Nobody asked, what happens when the rain stops? They should have asked, because the rain was always going to stop. In 1930, the drought arrived. It did not arrive like a storm. It arrived like a slow erasure. Rainfall totals fell, then fell again the following year, then again. The Missouri River dropped to levels not recorded since measurements began. Rivers that had run year-round on the plains slowed to a trickle and then to dry beds of cracked clay. Under ordinary circumstances, a drought on the Great Plains would have been survivable. The native grasses had evolved specifically for this. Their deep roots could reach water that surface crops could not. Their density would have held the topsoil against the wind. The land could have endured the dry years as it had endured them for thousands of years before. Diminished, stressed, but intact. But the native grasses were gone. 33 million acres of them, gone. In their place, dead wheat stalks, and under those stalks, bare, pulverized topsoil with no root structure, no biological cohesion, no mechanism for holding itself to the earth when the wind came. The soil had been reduced to dust, and now, with the drought removing the last residual moisture from the surface, that dust had nothing left to bind it. The wind on the Great Plains is not a gentle thing. It is a structural feature of the region's climate, a consequence of the flat terrain and the temperature differentials between the Gulf of Mexico to the south and the Canadian Arctic system to the north. Winds of 30, 40, 50 miles per hour are not remarkable on the plains. They are ordinary, and for 10,000 years the grass had endured them. But grass requires earth, and the earth was now powder. The first dust storms were reported in 1931. Small, localized, farmers noted them with concern and waited for the rains to return. In 1932, there were 14 significant dust storms recorded across the region. In 1933, there were 38. The frequency was accelerating. The storms were growing. Each event stripped more topsoil from the surface, leaving the ground even more vulnerable to the next storm, which then stripped more, which left the ground more vulnerable still. It was a cascade, a mechanical process of self-destruction that once set in motion had no natural off-switch. Hold on to that, because the worst had not yet begun. The third layer of evidence is the atmosphere itself, and this is where the science becomes genuinely unsettling. When topsoil dries to a certain particle size and loses its surface moisture, individual grains become subject to a process called saltation. Wind-driven particles bounce along the surface, striking other particles, releasing more dust into the air, which is then caught by the wind and carried upward. In the right conditions, this process does not produce a dust cloud. It produces something categorically different. It produces what meteorologists now classify as a haboob, a wall of suspended particulate matter, dense enough to reduce visibility to zero, tall enough to reach the upper troposphere, and electrically charged by the continuous friction of billions of particles against each other. On the Great Plains in the 1930s, the conditions for this process were not occasional. They were persistent. The stripped land, the drought, the relentless wind, the absence of any vegetative barrier, all of it created a system in which catastrophic dust events could form rapidly and with almost no warning. And they did. Survivors described the first sighting of a major black blizzard as impossible to process. The sky to the north or west would begin to darken, but it was not the darkness of cloud cover. It was denser, heavier. The darkness had texture. Witnesses described it as a cliff face moving across the horizon. A solid object, black and brown, sometimes rising to heights of 8,000 feet or more, taller than any building that existed in the world at the time. It moved at between 30 and 60 miles per hour. It did not dissipate at its edges. It simply advanced, consuming the landscape ahead of it, turning day to a darkness more complete than night. Because night has stars. When the wall hit, there was nothing. The electrical charge generated by these storms was measured and documented. Static electricity built to levels sufficient to short-circuit automobile ignition systems, to cause metal fences to glow and spark, to knock individuals unconscious through contact with grounded objects. Farmers reported that the static discharge from an approaching storm could be felt in the body before the wall was visible. A tingling in the fingers, a metallic taste in the mouth, hair standing upright. The land was generating its own electricity. The atmosphere was alive with the consequence of what had been done to the ground beneath it. And within the clouds themselves, the particles were not only soil. They were pathogens, fungal spores, bacteria. The disturbed earth released microbiological material that had been held stable for centuries. A new disease began appearing in the plains population: dust pneumonia. The X-rays of affected lungs looked like those of coal miners who had spent decades underground. Children were the most vulnerable. Families stuffed wet rags into door frames and window sills and hung damp sheets across interior doorways, and still the dust came through. It settled on dishes, on food, on skin. Infants were found smothered in their cribs by accumulations of fine particles that had drifted through sealed rooms like water through rock. April 14, 1935. The date exists in the historical record with a name: Black Sunday, and it represents the apex of this investigation, the moment when every layer of evidence converged into a single, definitive event. The morning had begun unusually. After weeks of punishing storms, The sky over the southern plains was clear. Temperatures were warm. The air was still. People who had been sheltering indoors for days emerged. Families went to church. Children played outside. Some accounts describe a collective mood of fragile relief, the sense that perhaps the worst had passed. Livestock that had been kept inside were let out to graze. Laundry was hung on lines. The ordinary rituals of life reasserted themselves in the brief window of calm. It was a Sunday in mid-April. It looked like the beginning of spring. By early afternoon, observers to the north began reporting what would become the largest single dust storm ever recorded in North American history. A system of cold air from Canada was driving down through the Dakotas, sweeping across Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, and Texas at speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour. But unlike previous storms, the dust being lifted by this system had been pre-dried and pre-loosened by weeks of preceding winds. The particulate density was catastrophic. The wall that formed was measured at approximately 8,000 feet in height and stretched laterally for over a mile on either side of its observable edge. Eyewitness accounts filed with journalists and government surveyors in the days that followed describe a sky that turned from blue to orange to red to absolute black. In under a minute, animals panicked and ran. Birds that had been in flight simply vanished, swallowed by the advancing wall. The temperature dropped 25 degrees in under an hour. Drivers on highways abandoned their vehicles when the dust extinguished their headlights and rendered navigation impossible. Families who had only moments before been outdoors in sunshine barricaded themselves inside their homes and waited in total darkness, unable to see their own hands before their faces, listening to the roar of 2 billion tons of topsoil moving over their rooftops. 2 billion tons. The estimates vary, but that figure, 2 billion tons of soil in a single storm event, the dust from that single event was carried eastward. It reached Chicago by evening. By the following day, it was over New York City, where it dimmed the light and left a visible film on windows and automobiles. Ships at sea 300 miles off the Atlantic coast reported reddish dust falling on their decks. The continent was quite literally being disassembled and scattered into the ocean. Inside the homes where the families had sealed themselves, the darkness and the noise were described in terms that survivors struggled to frame in ordinary language. The roar of the storm against exterior walls was compared to the sound of a freight train passing at close range, sustained for hours without interruption. The pressure differential caused by the mass of moving air outside drove dust through surfaces that appeared sealed. Photographs taken by federal surveyors in the immediate aftermath show interior rooms of apparently intact houses where every surface was coated in a uniform layer of fine brown dust. Floors, tables, beds, kitchen counters, as if the dust had been applied deliberately, with a brush. The families who survived Black Sunday did not emerge from their homes into daylight. They emerged into a landscape that had been physically altered. Dunes of earth, some reaching 10 and 15 feet in height, had formed against fence lines and buildings overnight. In some locations, entire structures had been partially buried. Fields that had shown bare soil the morning before were scoured down to subsoil or bedrock. The remaining topsoil simply gone, transported somewhere beyond recovery. Livestock that had been caught in the open were found dead, their lungs packed with particulate matter, their bodies already partially covered by drifting earth. The Red Cross declared dust pneumonia a disease of epidemic proportion across 5 states. Hospitals in towns like Liberal, Kansas, and Guymon, Oklahoma, reported wards filled beyond capacity. The mortality figures were never precisely compiled. The federal government was slow to acknowledge the scale of the public health catastrophe. but local records and retrospective epidemiological studies suggest thousands of deaths attributable directly to respiratory illness caused by dust exposure during the peak years of 1935 and 1936. And the families left, by the hundreds of thousands, and eventually by the millions. The displacement was not dramatic in the Hollywood sense. It was gradual, grinding, and deeply reluctant. These were people whose families had built their farms over generations, who had sunk their savings and their labor and their identity into land that was now burying them alive. The decision to leave was not a decision so much as a surrender. They loaded what they could onto vehicles that barely ran, and they drove west. California, primarily. Oregon. Washington. The roads were full of them. Federal estimates place the total displacement at somewhere between 2 and 3.5 million people over the decade, the largest internal migration in American peacetime history, driven entirely by a catastrophe that human decisions had engineered. The Soil Conservation Service was established in 1935 in direct response to Black Sunday. Surveyors were dispatched across the plains. What they found in their formal reports was extraordinary in its clinical horror. Approximately 100 million acres of formerly productive farmland had been rendered severely damaged or effectively destroyed by wind erosion. 100 million acres. An area larger than California. Not metaphorically gone, physically gone. The topsoil that had accumulated over 10,000 years of biological activity had been lifted into the atmosphere and dispersed. It could not be rebuilt in any human time frame. The government response was unprecedented for the era. Reforestation programs planted shelter belts, long lines of trees across the open plains, designed to interrupt the wind before it could build to storm velocities. Farmers were paid to leave marginal land fallow, to plant ground cover, to restore some fraction of the vegetative surface that had been stripped. It worked, partially, slowly, and incompletely. The drought broke in the early 1940s, and the rain that returned allowed the recovery programs to take hold. By the mid-1940s, the worst of the visible crisis had passed, but the land never fully recovered, not in any meaningful geological sense. What had been destroyed was not simply a crop. It was a system. The mycorrhizal networks in the soil, the fungal and bacterial communities that had taken millennia to establish, the seed banks of native plants buried in layers of undisturbed earth, all of it had been disrupted on a scale that even modern restoration ecology struggles to reverse. Areas that were plowed during the Great Plow-Up and subsequently damaged by the Dust Bowl have soil profiles today that are measurably impoverished compared to adjacent patches of never-plowed native grassland. The evidence is still in the ground. You can see it if you know where to look. And this is where the investigation demands that we look up from the evidence and ask the harder question. Because the mechanisms that produced the Dust Bowl have not disappeared. The gasoline tractor was not the last machine that extracted more from the soil than the soil could sustainably give. Industrial agriculture on the American plains today relies on aquifer systems, primarily the Ogallala Aquifer, which underlies roughly 174,000 square miles of the high plains, that are being drawn down at rates that exceed natural recharge by factors of 100 or more. The Ogallala took millions of years to fill. At current extraction rates, large portions of it will be functionally depleted within decades. The farmers who depend on it know this. The surveys document it clearly. The projections are not ambiguous. The native grassland ecosystem that once held the plains together has been reduced to fragments. Less than 1% of the original tallgrass prairie that once covered the eastern plains remains intact. The soil carbon that gave the Great Plains topsoil its extraordinary fertility has been depleted by decades of industrial cultivation, Topsoil loss due to erosion continues across agricultural regions worldwide at rates that soil scientists describe, without apparent alarm in public discourse, as unsustainable. The drought conditions that converged with the stripped landscape to produce the black blizzards were not extraordinary by geological standards. They were within the normal range of climatic variability for the region. Climate models projecting conditions across the American Southwest and Great Plains for the coming decades describe drought intensities and durations that will exceed what the region experienced in the 1930s. They describe this not as a possibility. They describe it as a probability. The families who abandoned their farms during the Dust Bowl years did not leave because the land failed them. The land failed because they had already, systematically, and in good faith, destroyed its capacity to hold. The distinction matters, because we are not, as a civilization, particularly good at holding that distinction in mind when the money is good and the wheat is growing and the tractors are running and the sky above the plains is blue and clear and full of light. That is the verdict this case arrives at, not a verdict against the farmers of the 1930s who were operating within the logic of their time and their economy with no malice and no warning. The verdict is against the assumption that productivity is the same thing as stability, that a landscape performing well is a landscape that will continue to perform, that the roots holding the earth in place are less important than the crop growing above them. The black blizzards did not arise from weather alone. They arose from the removal of everything that had made the weather survivable. Black Sunday, April 14th, 1935. The sky went dark at noon. 2 billion tons of continent moved east. And somewhere in that darkness, between the static electricity crackling across fence posts and the dust pressing through sealed walls into lungs that had no defense against it, the land was trying to communicate something that it had already communicated in its own language 10,000 years before any plow ever touched it. It was saying, "This is what holds. This is what you cannot take." We are still, in ways too important to list and too uncomfortable to name, in the process of deciding whether we heard it. I am Muris, watching the past so we can understand the present, and together, we keep history alive.